I'm hoping that what we're seeing now is people are actually experimenting with remote work. Now that we have, like what you mentioned, a work environment of which you want to create, not that you were forced to, sit in. But whether that's at a coffee shop or a co-working space, there's ways to kind of find how you thrive in that, and then the resources that a company can give their employees to thrive in a remote environment.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, sponsored by HR Benchmark Survey. You can take our HR survey at www.hrbenchmarksurvey.com. I am team remote work. I love working remotely, but there's a whole nother level of remote work that I don't think people are talking enough about, and that's asynchronous work. So imagine level 5 on Super Mario Brothers, and you're leveling up to 6, and that is asynchronous. Same game, the remote work game, but a whole nother level of remote work. So that is what we're going to be talking about today. And today I'm joined by Kendra Dixon. She's the Director of Operations for Parabol. Kendra leads operations at Parabol with over 15 years of experience building and managing teams in remote work environments. She came to Parabol from Techstars, where she managed the first remote accelerator supporting startups focused on the future of work. Kendra lives and works near San Diego, California. Kendra, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Thank you so much.
Yes, this is going to be such a fun interview, and I think so much help is needed in the areas that we're going to be talking about today. But first, let's start with some background. How did your early career trajectory lead to your current role?
So I was born and raised in San Jose, so I was in the midst of Silicon Valley when I graduated, and so I was heading in the path of tech. That's kind of was surrounding me. But really what led to remote work was I was ready to start a family, and I didn't want to kind of sacrifice wanting to be a mom, but also not wanting to sacrifice my career. And so I really started looking at how can I do both at the level I wanted to do it. And remote work, this was back in 2005, so it wasn't like there was a whole lot of opportunity for that. I was pretty much creating it for myself and looking for ways that I could have more flexibility and still have both of those things in my lives. And that's really what kind of forced that. And I've been working remotely since then.
I love that. And I love that you've been doing that since 2005. For me, it was 2007. And I think this is such an example of that you can still have a career, a successful career, and do it remotely.
Yes, absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about Parabol and its remote culture. How do you handle things like all hands meetings or company announcements?
Yeah, so Parabol is asynchronous by default. So we kind of look for, does something really need to be a meeting, or can we handle this asynchronously? And that has been able to help us with time zones, making sure that we've got all voices heard, across the company. From when it comes to like announcements, Slack is really where kind of we live and breathe most of the work day. And so we've got an announcement channel so people know to be keeping an eye out on that. If it's something that we need somebody or everyone to take action on, we'll probably also bring those to the weekly action meeting. So the team leads are bringing those, making sure everyone kind of hears and knows about those things. And then when it comes to, and then also from like announcements of our metrics, like the leadership team meets every Monday, we record like our core metrics while we're going over them. And then we post those in the announcement channel as well. So people can just kind of stay up to date with where things are at. When it came to things like all hands, it was really fun to kind of look at it as like, okay, if we're saying we're asynchronous, does this need to be a meeting? What does this look like in a remote environment? And so we have been experimenting for almost a year now and we actually call them AMAs, where it's kind of like ask the leadership team anything that's, currently on your mind. And we'll set it up as a asynchronous retrospective where there's quite like, what kind of questions do you have? What concerns do you have? What comments do you have? And we give people the way to kind of anonymously put all that information into a retrospective. Then the leadership team can take that information, group it And then we together will record, typically through Zoom or Loom, the answers to all of those, and then post those inside of Slack for everyone to comment on. And that's where kind of the follow-up conversations can happen. But we're doing that once a quarter now, and it's working really well for the reasons I said in the beginning, where everyone has a chance to get their voices heard. It's not those that are like brave enough to ask a question in front of everybody. We're all together, or anyone that happens to be completely different time zone from myself can still get their question answered. And so that's been working really well, and we've gotten some great feedback from the company and the employees in terms of that form of communication for those types of questions.
So for those people who don't know, can you explain what asynchronous working is?
So asynchronous means it's not all happening at the same time. So essentially, we will start it online, and people can put in their information, and then at a certain point in time, we say, okay, you have until, we leave the board open for, say, 5 days. You can get all of your information in there over the course of those 5 days at your convenience, the way you of which have the time to kind of sit down and think about it. So it lets people kind of use, as we call it, like the slow brain, and think about what they really, what questions they really want to bring to it. And that's really what asynchronous means, is it's happening at the individual schedule. We put deadlines so that everyone kind of knows, okay, you have until here, so that we can keep things moving. But it doesn't have to be everyone shows up at the same time, whether that's 12 p.m. or 12 a.m. for somebody, and then try to make decisions at a specific date and time. It's happening more over a fluid, asynchronously, and then that way we can kind of make sure everyone has the chance to review and participate.
I love it. And thank you for sharing, because there's probably going to be someone that's like, I don't know what asynchronous means. But I'll give you another example. I have a new team member we hired this week. He lives in Brazil. He asked me, when do I need to come to work? And I was like, I don't care when you work. You work at a schedule that's good for you. The only time he needs to be present is on our team calls. And his time zone, I'm in the central time zone. He is 2 hours ahead of me. So if he wants to work at 3 a.m., that is totally up to him. And that is what asynchronous work is all about.
Exactly.
You mentioned some tools. You mentioned Slack, which I hope that people are familiar with. You mentioned Zoom, which we're recording on Zoom right now for the podcast interview. But then you mentioned Loom. Tell me what Loom is, maybe for someone who's not familiar.
Yeah, so Loom is a great way to record your screen and yourself at the same time. And so we have really embraced it for kind of something that needs further explanation or would take too long to write everything out, to quickly kind of share something. And so we have really started using Loom to, maybe you need to give feedback on something. And so you can be doing it while you're recording your screen and then be able to share that. And so we use Loom for a lot of that type of communication, where something might need a little bit more in-depth detail around it, or the nuance of just writing something might get lost. So you're giving, or you want to show something while you're talking, and that's the best way to do that, and still be asynchronous. So then somebody else can just watch it on their time and be able to get back to you and comment on it later.
I love that. And really, I will say, because we do this also at Workology, and it really works. I can give feedback in a 5-minute video on Loom or other tools and send it over to that team member, and they can get exactly what they need when they need it. And we also will use that for training too, screen training. And then other people can have access to how to do something without me having, or another member on the team having to retrain and do it all live over and over and over again.
Oh yes, I've used it before as like creating SOPs, because you can just walk through what you're doing, and then you can create a checklist that might match that. So they've got both. You've got a physical document, but then if you ever need to go in, you've got the video to kind of match, to dig into more detail if you needed it.
So if you are not sure about remote work, this is the podcast for you to listen to, because we're giving you all our secrets, really. I mean, these are, I mean, they're really, honestly, it's a challenge, but if you're intentional, it doesn't have to be, I think, as hard as everybody is making it out to be. You worked remotely for quite some time before you joined Parabol in 2021. We talked about this at the beginning of the interview. How does your remote work background inform your work now? Tell me about that.
Good question. It's obviously shaped the way of which I work, so therefore the way of which I communicate. But the things that I look for in terms of shaping what I'm doing right now, it's really looking at the building a culture of a company. With being remote, you do have to be more intentional. There are things that you have to be more intentional to overcome the nuances that are lost when you've got your team next to you, like the casual conversation, those kind of things. So it's looking at when I want to have influence with my role in operations of the way of which this culture continues to build as we continue to grow, is what are the things that we put in place to kind of make sure that we truly feel like we have a culture and it's not just silos of people working, everywhere. And so those are the things that really kind of make me look at how are we shaping the culture of the company. An example of that is we're starting to do more in-person meetups again, now that we've survived COVID, we're getting through, and we've really started to say, you know what, our meetups are more about building trust and connection, even over completing work when we are together. And so that's been really important as we're creating some of these upcoming events, is what are we doing just to kind of build that trust and connection? Because that's the most important thing for our in-person time, because we know we can be productive when we are, remote and back at our individual workspaces.
How would you describe Parabol's role working with companies, many of which do not have remote workforces before we had a global pandemic?
True. So one of the ways that I love what we're doing is Parabol is open source, but not just for a product perspective. We're also that way in terms of how we're building Parabol. And so every Friday we do a recap of what we did that week, what our metrics look like, and we're posting it on our website. I think we just surpassed 300 posts of these weekly updates of what we're doing. And so it's an insight into how we've been doing it, so people can, see for themselves the successes and the attempts, the things that have and haven't worked for us. We also have a bunch of resources on our website in terms of guides and blog posts that kind of talk about asynchronous communication, the way of which we use Slack, the way we do asynchronous governance. If somebody has a tension around something and want to change the way we do something, there's a way to do that, and we've got a process for it, and we share that all externally for people to use. We also love to kind of come up with different templates within our own product to help companies experiment with the way of which they work together and communicate with each other.
I love that you're willing to share, and I want to put some of these resources that you're talking about here on the show notes for the Workology podcast. So we'll make sure to include some of these resources, because again, this is really, I think, for someone who maybe is not sure remote working isn't working for them, or they want to be better working remotely. There are so many great resources that Parabol has. Let's take a reset. My name is Jess Miller-Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast, and it's sponsored by the HR Benchmark Survey. Take our HR survey at www.hrbenchmarksurvey.com. And today, I'm talking with Kendra Dixon. She's the Director of Operations for Parabol.
Benchmarking and data is crucial to HR leaders. Workology's HR Benchmark Survey is an always-on survey, and just by taking the survey at hrbenchmarksurvey.com, you're signing up to get comprehensive quarterly results, white papers, and other research from the survey right to your inbox. It takes 10 minutes or less to complete. Visit hrbenchmarksurvey.com.
I want to go back a little bit to something that you were talking about. We talked about remote work and asynchronous, and then you talked about in-person events. And I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about the culture at Parabol, and how do you make sure that there is culture in your organization remotely and asynchronously, and then in person? How does that all kind of work for you and the organization?
Sure. So as I did mention before, we kind of default to asynchronous. And me coming into Parabol a year ago now, that was even a welcoming learning curve for me. Even though I'd been remote for so many years, there was still the default to hop on a call or hop on like create a meeting so that we could meet and discuss about it. And so I've appreciated this last year kind of really looking at what it means to do asynchronously well. And that really comes down to like written communication. Like, how good are you at writing things down so that somebody else can come in and clearly understand like what you are asking for, what you need. And so getting really good at asking for what you need. And so these skills are obviously just great skills to have, but it just proves that you can do it asynchronously if you just take the time to actually really think about what you're communicating and what you need. And that's what I think is such an impressive like piece of our culture within Parabol. And one of the things that stands out for me coming in, not coming from even though I was remote, but not coming from that asynchronous environment.
I feel like you just described like another level of remote work, because again, you were saying like, oh, let's hop on a call or let's have a Zoom meeting. But the next level, if I'm thinking about remote work, like a video game, like Mario Brothers or something, is like once you pass level 5, you go to level 6, and then level 6 is the asynchronous component. And some things are the same, like some of the characters in that previous level you see, but there's just different layers of complexity and challenges that you don't face, or that are just different when you are not all working at the same time. But in my experience also too, I do love asynchronous work because also my team is working when I'm sleeping. So we can be a 24/7 operation, and I can go to bed, and then all the things that I wanted to get done in the next 24 hours are already complete.
Yes. And also it really makes you think at what's really an emergency, what can like give more thought, what can wait for like quality feedback, or what do you really need that is urgent right now. And so it makes you kind of prioritize things, like forced prioritization instead of everything needing to be urgent and right now, which I've also appreciated, because it's amazing how many things truly were not emergencies and worked themselves out because you could go through that process. But yeah, and I love how you just said it's like that next level, because I really feel like that for me in terms of just how good you have to get at communication, which just serves you as a person, but it also serves the company when you're writing things down and you've got that to work through together.
Yeah, no, the communication piece and planning, like you can't just be all crazy and be like, hey, we have a big fire drill that we're going to do today or here's the new priority that's just come on everybody's plate, because everybody might not be working in that moment. So you do have to be real intentional and organized. And like you were saying, have SOPs and a system and tools that people can access if they have questions, because what you don't want to happen is for something to take 5 more days because there's back and forth around questions and clarity.
Exactly. And that's where, when you see when something is taken too long, it's that moment to kind of stop and pause and say, okay, what broke? Was it the communication? Should this have been, elevated to a meeting? Like, you're able to kind of look back at those and say, okay, where did the system break? Because it shouldn't slow you down. If anything, like your point is, there's people still working when you're sleeping. It should speed you up. And so if that's not happening, it's a matter of looking at, okay, well, where in the process did it break down?
This makes me think of a long time ago when I worked at corporate and I worked at Home Depot. And those were back in the days where we didn't have Zoom, and you just basically sat on conference calls all day. And somebody decided that there would be no more conference calls ever again, and that we would just use live TV from the executive team talking about priorities. And we couldn't live without conference calls. However, the week before the change where there were going to be no conference calls, I had more conference calls that week than I ever had my entire life, because everybody was trying to get in.
Right.
All their communication the old way before we moved to the new way. And I think that when I think about like what's happened to us over the last 2.5 years, there's still a lot of people who want to operate in that space. And there is a better way if you're willing to, like you said, be organized and planned. But it just made me laugh because oh my gosh, I think I was probably on 25 conference calls that week. It was a ridiculous number. And then everybody for like 3 weeks didn't have any conference calls. And of course, we couldn't function without some form of communication because there was really no
There was
replacement.
no Slack or
No, there wasn't. I mean, there were still inter-office memos that came in those manila envelopes back in that day. So they kudos for trying, but it didn't really work for us. One question I also wanted to ask you was, what do you see as the most important benefit for an organization who's shifting to remote work?
From a company's perspective, I have to say that you just open yourself up to a larger and more diverse talent pool because you are able to recruit from anywhere. Now we're experimenting with, do we really mean anywhere? Like, are we okay with any time zone, or is there some that might be too far of a delay, so then somebody's having to wait too long to kind of hear from someone? And we're slowly kind of figuring that out. But yeah, we're able to find people from all over the world, and that is also matching who our customers are. So now we have people within the company that match the people using our product, and so that's a great advantage for us as well. And then from a people perspective, because that's really what drives me, is we're able to create a work environment that is people first. They get to kind of decide what environment they can thrive in as an employee, and that's really what, like, them thriving only helps us from a company perspective as well. So those are really the two main reasons it just makes sense to me to want to be a part of a company that is remote.
Agreed. I mean, I have access to so many amazing people. You just have to be self-aware, especially if you're not only hiring remote people in the US and other countries. For example, we're recording this week was Memorial Day. So Monday, a lot of my team was off that are US based. Right. And then I have a number of people who are in Kenya. And today, Wednesday, was a holiday for Kenya. It was kind of their Independence Day. So I just have to be flexible. And also my team has to communicate because I didn't know, but somebody sent me a note. Hey, I am not going to be on the team meeting because I went to festivities and I'm not going to get back in time. So you just have to be flexible for those kind of moments and open to cultural shifts or holidays that you might not be aware of, or norms. I also work a lot with organizations in Israel, and their work week starts on Sunday. It's Sunday through Thursday. So I know that if I message them on Friday, I'm not going to get a response till Sunday.
Yep. And I mean, that's why, again, the more asynchronous you can make your communication style, the easier it is to do just that. It's funny because we have our company calendar, and yes, we'll have everybody's, you'll see all the different holidays and the flag, we put the flag next to it to know what country is on what kind of holiday. So, and then we actually came up with country leads so that they can then make sure that the holidays are getting updated. So there's somebody, because we're just too small of a team from an HR perspective to have, a team managing this. So we picked an individual from that country to kind of make sure that they communicate, let everyone else know on the calendar what their countries. And then we have core Parabol ones where we know everyone will be off. And so, yeah, we've been managing it that way. So it's fun to see the different calendar markings that are on there.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a really smart way to make sure that you're inclusive and no one feels like they're left out or that they have to work on a holiday.
Right.
Let's talk about advice for HR leaders. How can they better support a hybrid workforce? And my other question, which I feel like is the $1 million question, how do we keep everyone involved at the same engagement level when you are remote or hybrid?
That is one of the most important questions on the engagement side. I feel like a broken record, but asynchronous communication is probably the best answer I could think of from a hybrid workforce, because when it's written down, when you have, you're giving everyone the time so that they can respond when it, works for them based off of what you need, then it doesn't matter if they're sitting next to you or if they're 3 time zones away. And so asynchronous, just from a communication perspective, I think helps level I don't want to say level the playing field. It just makes sure that all the voices can be heard and that you can actually not miss out on somebody that happens to be in a different time zone that could have valuable input to add to what you're doing. And then you don't want to punish those that are in person by saying, we're not going to have social events and those kind of things because these people wouldn't be able to participate. It's just making sure that when you're working on things and if you're defaulting to asynchronous communication, everyone is getting to be able to have a voice, and then you can have the social opportunities for those that happen to be within a particular region. And then you can also have the opportunities to do, like when we're going to do an all company and we're getting everyone together, then we're making sure that we're doing a lot of cross functioning so that people from different circles within the company can be meeting each other when we actually do get to meet up in person. And then we're experimenting with some regional ones so that it's slightly, more cost effective, and yet we'll get some people that they might not see each other, but they live close enough that we could do a regional meetup and let people see each other that way, so that we're keeping people engaged and they're feeling like they are a part of the culture that we're creating, even if it happens to not be the same. They're on the same team. It's just other ways to still build that connection and be remote.
Pre-pandemic, I have a friend who works in HR and it's a large company, Fortune 100. And she was one of the only remote people at the organization, in HR anyway. And they would have their birthday celebrations and she would not get invited, right? Because she was the only remote person on the team. So they just didn't think to invite. And I think that now, especially if we're going back to hybrid, we can't have an excuse for that. So we need to come up with something simple. And it could be just really easy. Like everybody at the office records a happy birthday video to that person. They send them the video, and then maybe a little cupcake is delivered to their home. And it doesn't have to be super complicated or overdone. We don't have to invite everyone to a happy hour where everybody has a cocktail or whatever, but just the little things to acknowledge, because while I love working remotely, it can be a little lonely. So you do have to try to find ways to keep your people engaged and excited and making little efforts.
Yes. Yeah. It's how do you add a little bit of fun so that they kind of feel there's just connection besides just the work being done. We did right before we closed for the 2 last weeks of the year. And so it's not necessarily Christmas break, and it just depends on where you are. And so we wanted to do some kind of thing for everybody to just kind of have fun and get together. And so we did a scavenger hunt. That's what it is.
Yeah.
So at the second week of December is kind of a way to just bring fun to everyone. Before we went on break, we did a scavenger hunt in your own local area. So we had a whole bunch of ways of things they had to go find and sort out, and they had to take pictures or take a little video. And so we did all of that remotely, wherever you happen to be. And yet it was a way for us to kind of all share it with each other. And so it was really fun to kind of see the feed going through. For that, we actually there was a third-party company that we could sign up, and so that they could post directly with the scavenger list that they had to find. But it was a really fun way to kind of do something here local where I happen to be, and somebody else in another country was doing the same thing, and we were sharing it, whether it was posting your favorite mug or it was go finding a fountain in somewhere in a square. So that was a great way to kind of add some fun and do it remotely.
I love that. I love that. What would you say is the biggest draw for candidates that want to work at Parabol?
I would say we definitely advertise a lot that we have limited meetings, so that you really get, we give people a lot, autonomy to figure out the way they want to work. And so I think that is a draw for a lot of people that find their way to Parabol. And then I think the second one is really the fact that we are building a product that we use ourselves to help us work better at remote work. And so getting to kind of be a part of solving the problem and then being able to share that then with others and make it easier for everyone else as well. So that I think that's really the two things that I hear a lot about when candidates are kind of excited to to come and work with us, like what brought them there. It's really what we're building and the way of which we're building it.
I love that. And I'm sure the candidates are like, this sounds great. I'm hearing so many people that are like, my company's making me go back to work and I'm out of here.
Yeah.
I'm finding me something else that works with my life and my schedule. Not everybody's like that. There are people who are like, yay, we're going back to the office. It's so exciting. And I love those individuals. I think that's great. It works for them. I sometimes do like to go to my office and work, but I really like working in bed and when I want and when it works for my schedule and wherever I want.
Exactly.
Is there anything else I haven't asked about today that you want to share?
Well, probably just to touch more on what you had just said. I get, not to get on a soapbox, I won't, but so many people talked about like COVID was like the big remote work experiment. And that frustrates me because that was really just a surviving a pandemic experiment. And we were fortunate enough that many people were able to work remotely. But I had been working remotely. I was not thriving when COVID hit and I was able to keep working remotely. Like that was a challenge and I wasn't always great at it because we were living through a pandemic. And so I'm hoping that what we're seeing now is people are actually experimenting with remote work. Now that we have, like what you mentioned, the work environment of which you want to create, not that you were forced to, sit in. But whether that's at a coffee shop or a co-working space, there's ways to kind of find how you thrive in that, and then the resources that a company can give their employees to thrive in a remote environment. And so that's really what I'm hoping we're seeing now is this experimenting with hybrid and remote is because now we have the environment that we can create it the way we want to and not be forced. And I have my entire family home with me while I'm still trying to work. Like that was not the ideal work environment. And so if people say I couldn't do it, I had to go back, it's like, well, if you built it differently, how could you actually, would you actually thrive in it?
I love that. I want people to think about work differently. And honestly, my goal is to be able to travel wherever, work wherever, be in another country and work. If I want to go to Mexico for 60 days or Dominican Republic or Portugal, I have a friend who just came back from a trip while he was working, him and his wife the whole time. They actually bought a house. So I do believe the world of work is changing. I don't want to go back to the way that it was before. And I really don't want my team to go back unless they really want to. So I appreciate all your insights. I love hearing what's working for Parabol because you're a growing organization. You have a complex HR team and it gives people something I think to really look up to and aspire to.
Thank you so much, Jessica. This has been fun.
Yeah, thank you for taking part in the podcast. I will link to your LinkedIn profile and some resources on the Parabol website. But is there, and maybe they want to join your team. So we'll link to the jobs career site too. Maybe they're like, yes, I need a new gig.
We are hiring.
You are hiring. So is there anywhere else that you want to direct them to if they wanted to learn more about you and Parabol?
Parabol.co is really the best place to start. And we've got all the resources there, whether it's the blog, our Friday ships, and then all of our job postings as well.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
If you don't know already, I love, love, love remote work. And as soon as my daughter graduates, I'm finding myself a beach and I'm just going to be working from there, traveling all over. That is my plan. 2027, when Riley graduates, that is my mission. And there are a lot of other people who love remote work, the flexibility, whether it's asynchronous or real time. There are people who don't want to go back to the office. And if we want to retain those people or attract new people who are like that, we need to be thinking about remote work. I'd love being able to sit down with workplace leaders at fully remote companies like Parabol. I think we'll see more of these leadership roles, especially within HR. And I so much appreciate Kendra for taking the time to share her expertise with us today. And I thank you for listening and joining us on the Workology podcast, sponsored by HR Benchmark Survey. That's hrbenchmarksurvey.com. Take our HR survey. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who is tired of the status quo and maybe wants to work near a beach or some remote, fun island destination. This is Jess Miller Merrill. Until next time, you can visit workology.com and to listen to all our previous podcast episodes.